Actually, it doesn't matter as individuals where we begin in the field of elder abuse. Ultimately, we can, and I underscore, we really must do it all. In other words, our to-do list always must be a composite of research, policy, and practice, not an absolute devotion to any particular one.
Welcome to the National Center on Elder Abuse podcast, your trusted source for the latest news, research, and policy in elder justice. The NCEA is excited to introduce the OGs of Elder Justice series, where you'll hear trailblazers in the field share their passions, joys, collaborations, challenges, and innovations, or any combination thereof, through informal and candid conversations. In this podcast episode, Dr. Georgia Anetzberger discusses two interconnected topics: her elder abuse work and the remarkable contributions of Betty Lau in the field of elder justice. The episode addresses the importance of research, policy, and practice in advancing the field. Dr. Anetzberger has authored over 100 scholarly publications on aging and elder abuse. She is widely regarded as the OG of elder justice and has spent over 40 years as a practitioner, educator, researcher, and community advocate. She currently serves on the advisory board for the National Center on Elder Abuse.
I'm going to talk about two topics, and at first they're going to seem totally unrelated to each other, but actually they have a lot of connection to them. The first topic is elder abuse work, and the second is Elizabeth Lau, or Betty, as most of her friends called her, and I was both a friend and a colleague of hers for many, many years. So I'm going to begin with Betty, and she had a saying that she often used: "Nobody ever died from dirt." And I remember it decades later, not only because she said it frequently, but because it was so compelling as a way to think of things. Betty, of course, was referring to self-neglectors, and these are people, usually older adults, who fail to take care of themselves, usually because of physical or mental impairments. In other words, they may not bathe, take prescribed medications, or eat healthy food, and as a result, they can be at considerable risk of harm or even death without outside help. However, to Betty, being dirty alone just didn't cut it, no matter how somebody smelled or looked as a result. But I digress. I'll come back to Betty in a few minutes. I want to begin more by talking about elder abuse work, which, by the way, is something that Betty did, and she did in a spectacular sort of way for many, many years. It may surprise some of you when I say that elder abuse work is and must be a trilogy of opportunities for doing good. At its simplest, that work is about undertaking research, policy, or practice regarding the maltreatment of older adults. But more specifically, research can be the empirical study of elder abuse in order to gain understanding of its various dimensions and dynamics. Policy work in this regard can require developing or advocating for laws or rules needed to address the problem, or funding for related services or programs. In practice, of course, very typically involves action, responding to elder abuse in order to prevent, detect, or treat it. However, research, policy, and practice are not separate and distinct activities in elder abuse work. They're intimately connected. Policy is important to research, practice is important to research, and they're all connected in such fundamental ways. For example, research is important to policy and practice because it provides direction, acknowledges accomplishment, and justifies change. More specifically, several years ago, there was a recognition that we just didn't have what we needed in terms of good prevalence research in elder abuse. And so there was an effort at that time to make that a reality. And so there were a couple studies that were done in the period of time from 2000 to 2010 were able to bring that to the forefront. And that prevalence research not only revealed that approximately in the United States, 1 in 10 older Americans experienced the problem in a given year, it also found that the abuser is most likely to be a family member and that a key risk factor is lack of social support. Well, information like this suggests where attention should be directed in preventing elder abuse from happening in the first place, thereby setting the stage for creating and sustaining viable programs. Likewise, policy and practice are important to research. They suggest priorities, provide data, and give meaning. And let me give you an example of that. Recognizing the connections, a few years ago, the federal government's Administration for Community Living led efforts that resulted in a research agenda for adult protective services. Now, as most everybody on this podcast knows, adult protective services is such an important and viable response to elder abuse. It's really the only nationwide intervention dedicated to addressing this problem. The purpose of that research agenda was to identify critical questions that must be answered in order for adult protective services to better address reported situations of elder abuse. Those contributing to the agenda's contents, and I was one of the researchers involved, but there were also practitioners. There was a recognition of the interdependence of research, policy, and practice, and how a research agenda like this, embodying all three of those things, can help move forward the field and create an evidence base for adult protective services programming, enabling that program to better do the work charged by law that it has to do. Actually, it doesn't matter as individuals where we begin in the field of elder abuse. Ultimately, we can, and I underscore, we really must do it all. In other words, our to-do list always must be a composite of research, policy, and practice, not an absolute devotion to any particular one. Since one size doesn't quite fit all, so to speak, it can be comforting to know that there are many options within each chosen path. Researchers, for example, have a variety of ways to connect with policy. For example, as a researcher, when I develop an article around the findings from my research, I need always to consider the policy and practice implications for that publication. Well, to do it well, I could convene a group of policymakers or advocates for their perspectives, because that will enrich the article in a very important ways. But researchers can also connect with policy through policy forums, joining an advocacy group, or simply giving public testimony when legislation of an elder abuse nature is under consideration. In a similar sort of way, policy wonks and practitioners have options for connecting to research. They can link with researchers to evaluate services, identify what works and what doesn't work with respect to interventions, and to assess client satisfaction. They also can benefit from knowing key research findings so that these can help guide policy change and program development. Now I want to return to Betty Lau, who is this truly incredible pioneer in the field of elder abuse and really such a genuine role model for doing it all in elder abuse work. I first come across Betty in the late 1970s. And at that point in time, she coordinated adult protective services for the Chronic Illness Center, a unit of our county hospital system in Greater Cleveland, Ohio. Betty was a social worker by background, and she was struck by the variety of protective situations referred to the Chronic Illness Center and the absolute absence of any research on elder abuse at that point in time. Now, in reality, elder abuse was only first talked about in the mid-1970s of the scope that it ultimately is recognized to have. And those first talking about happening both in the United States as well as in Great Britain. In the United States, it was Robert Butler's 1975 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Why Survive Being Old in America. And in Great Britain, it was a couple of physicians, although Robert Butler also was a physician, but a couple of physicians in Great Britain who wrote very short articles on the subject. Well, Betty was so obsessed with the fact that there was no research and all the questions that poured out of her in terms of her own association with this problem. She wondered about how often does elder abuse occur? What are its types? What characteristics exist for abused older adults? Who does the abusing? And the list of questions went on, and Betty wanted answers to those questions. But she was not a researcher. She was a practitioner. And so she decided to contact somebody that could be of assistance. Now, she also was an adjunct faculty member of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. And so she decided to enlist the help of the one faculty member in that school specializing in aging, and that happened to be Jordan Cosberg. Together, they designed and completed the very first research anywhere in the world on elder abuse, initially presenting it locally at a community forum and then nationally at the annual scientific meeting of the Gerontological Society of America, and that was in 1978, before finally having it published in 1979 in a magazine called Aging, which was then put out by the federal government's Administration on Aging. Now, you might be interested in what that article had to say. Well, the title of it was Abuse of the Elderly by Informal Care Providers. And it was interesting. It was a look at 404 older adults who had been referred to the Chronic Illness Center during a one-year period of time from 1977 to 1978. Interestingly enough, what was found that, just as was learned more recently in much more sophisticated research, 1 in 10 cases had suffered from elder abuse. The types of abuse that were evident were multiple, including physical, psychological, material abuse, as well as violation of rights. The vast majority of these individuals had experienced multiple abuse forms. Nearly all the abusers were family members, again, like we found in much more sophisticated research later on. And about 3/4 of the victims had at least one major physical or mental impairment. Well, practice had led Betty to research, and practice and research combined moved Betty towards policy. Her grounding in protective services as well as elder abuse research resulted in Betty being asked to chair a local committee that had been charged with developing state adult protective services legislation. I was the staff to that committee, and the committee came out of a planning organization in Greater Cleveland and an entity within it called the Council on Older Persons. It happened to be a committee of 10 persons, all but one of them women, 4 attorneys, 4 social workers, plus 1 nurse and 1 long-term care ombudsman. Coming together, they devoted an entire year to putting together a draft of legislation worthy of submission to the Ohio General Assembly, and they met every 2 weeks for hours at a time to do exactly that, and Betty led it all. The legislation had a prime sponsor and co-sponsors, was introduced in the Ohio General Assembly, and after multiple hearings and countless contacts with legislators, the bill was passed into law as an amendment to our state biennium budget in 1981. But that wasn't the end of Betty's policy connections. In the meanwhile, Congresswoman Mary Rose Okar out of Cleveland had heard through that nurse on the committee about Betty's research and other elder abuse work. Actually, the nurse on the committee was also Congresswoman Okar's legislative aide. And so Congressman Okar was just absolutely captured by this problem area of great concern to her because she had a passion about older people in general. With the help and support from Congressman Claude Pepper, who was then chair of the United States House Select Committee on Aging, she put together a draft of legislation on adult abuse that was modeled after Child Protective Services law. She came back through that nurse to that committee that Betty led around drafting Ohio's Adult Protective Services legislation and asked that committee and Betty for comment on the proposed legislation before it was submitted. That legislation at the federal level became House Resolution 755 when it was introduced in the 96th Congress, and it had as its intent, and I quote, to provide financial assistance for programs for the prevention, identification, and treatment of adult abuse, neglect, and exploitation, as well as to establish a national center on adult abuse. And it had some other purposes as well. Well, as you might imagine, there were a number of hearings around this, but the first one was on June 11th, 1980. And it was a hearing that combined both the United States Senate Special Committee on Aging as well as the United States House Select Committee on Aging. And its purpose was to look at the problem of adult abuse and the need for related federal policy, and specifically this one that had been addressed. It goes without saying that Betty was asked to testify that day. And what she did in doing so was to tell the audience about some of the cases of elder abuse that she had encountered. She talked about, for example, an 83-year-old woman who had been beaten by a hairbrush by her caregiving sister as punishment for incontinence and disobedience. It might interest you to know that this same sister also had 10 children that she treated similarly. But he also talked about an 86-year-old woman neglected by her resident son to the point that she had numerous bed sores, weighed only 80 pounds, and was left naked and alone in bed all day, every day. After talking about the situations she encountered, she concluded her testimony by stating, and I quote, "This federal legislation will provide the necessary incentives to the states to enact their own legislation focusing on this critical problem," and I quote. Betty saw the connection between research, policy, and practice, and she also saw the connection between federal and state legislation. Like many of us, Betty had distinct preferences. She was a practitioner by nature, and she was a true Ohioan who loved the state and lived here all of her life. But in addressing elder abuse, she understood that we can never confine ourselves to a single path of action. We always must be willing to do it all.
As we close, we want to ask you, as we ask all of the OGs on this series, one question. What's one example of a key principle that guides you professionally and personally?
Well, I had to come up with two. I hope it doesn't matter, but the first one is service. And what that means to me is the importance of making a contribution, no matter big or small, no matter what it happens to be, but doing something that's meaningful for society at large, trying to make a difference. And related to that, the second one is respect and absolute belief in the inherent worth and dignity of all things, living and not living, and recognizing that, in fact, we're all interdependent. Therefore, respect has to be a component of that.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please stay tuned for our next podcast featuring OGs Dr. Jackie Gray and Cynthia LeConte, elder justice pioneers, collaborators, and friends who've been at the forefront of addressing elder abuse in Indian country.